The bidding room went silent the moment the number flashed on the board. $1. That was my bid, and nobody in that crowded hall of scavengers, brokers, and half-bankrupt haulers thought it was worth arguing over. I remember laughing quietly to myself, because I had walked into that auction expecting nothing, and I was about to walk out owning something nobody else wanted. My name is Ren Kelder, and I have spent most of my working life buying things other people gave up on. I am not human. Where I come from, on a mining colony 3 jumps from anywhere important, we learn early that value is not fixed. Value is whatever someone else has stopped believing in. That belief, or the lack of it, is where I make my living. The auction hall was on Korvat Station, a rusted ring of docking clamps and debt collectors floating at the edge of a dying trade route. The shipping company that used to run this station had folded 18 months earlier, and everything they once owned was being sold off in pieces to cover what they owed: engines, fuel cells, cargo containers still sealed with old manifests taped to the doors. And then, buried near the bottom of the catalogue, item 447. Hangar Bay, contents unknown, sold as is, no refunds, no inspections permitted before sale. Everyone skipped past it. Someone near me joked that contents unknown usually meant a hangar full of nothing but old dust and a jammed door, and that the auction house probably could not even find the access codes anymore. Another trader muttered that unopened lots at bankruptcy sales were almost always empty shells, listed just so the auctioneers could pad their numbers and make the sale look bigger than it was. I did not say anything. I just watched the numbers scroll by on the display, waiting to see if anyone would bid at all. Nobody did. When the auctioneer called the lot, his voice barely rose above the murmur of side conversations. He asked for an opening bid of $1, purely as a formality, expecting someone to raise it a few hundred credits out of curiosity, and then move on. I raised my hand before he even finished the sentence. $1. The room laughed. Somebody behind me said I had more money than sense. The auctioneer, looking almost embarrassed on my behalf, asked if there were any other bids. Silence. He brought the gavel down, and just like that, Hangar Bay 447 belonged to me. I want to be honest about why I did it. It was not because I sensed anything special. It was not some quiet feeling in my gut that told me I had found treasure. I bid $1 because $1 was nothing, and nothing is exactly what I expected to get in return. If the hangar really was empty, I had lost less than the price of a cup of recycled coffee. If there was anything inside at all, even scrap metal I could melt down and sell by weight, I would come out ahead. That was the whole calculation. Scavengers do not dream. We do arithmetic. The paperwork took less time than the bidding had. A clerk with tired eyes stamped a transfer chip and handed it to me without looking up, already moving on to the next lot before I had even left the counter. I remember thinking that the whole transaction felt too easy, the kind of easy that should have made me suspicious. But greed and boredom make people ignore warning signs, and I was feeling both that day. Korvat Station's lower ring, where the old hangars were kept, had not seen real traffic in years. The lighting strips along the corridor flickered every few meters, half of them dead, the other half buzzing like something trapped inside the glass. My footsteps echoed against metal walls that had not been cleaned since the shipping company went under. Dust drifted in slow spirals whenever the air recyclers kicked on, catching the weak light and scattering it like fine gray snow. I passed 6 hangars before I found the one with my number stenciled above the door. 447. The paint had faded so badly that I had to run my fingers over the numbers to be sure I was reading them right. Unlike the doors before it, this one had no obvious damage, no dents, no rust streaks bleeding down from the seams. It looked, if anything, deliberately closed, sealed, not abandoned. The access panel beside the door was dark. I pressed my transfer chip against the reader and waited. Nothing happened for a long moment. Long enough that I started composing a complaint in my head about faulty equipment and demanding a partial refund on my $1. Then, with a groan that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside the wall itself, the door shuddered and began to slide open. Stale air rolled out to meet me first, carrying a smell I did not recognize right away. Metal and oil, yes, that was expected, but underneath it, there was something else. Something old, almost sweet, like preserved wood or dried leaves pressed flat between the pages of a book nobody had opened in a very long time. It was not an unpleasant smell. It was simply out of place, the kind of thing that made the back of my neck prickle before my mind had even decided why. The hangar lights did not come on automatically. I had to find a manual switch bolted to the wall just inside the door, and when I flipped it, only a third of the overhead fixtures actually responded. Even so, that was enough light to see what filled the space in front of me, and for a moment I simply stood there, forgetting to breathe. It was a ship, not a shuttle, not a cargo hauler, not any of the small utility craft I had half expected to find crammed into a hangar this size. It was a warship, long and dark, its hull curving up toward the ceiling, like the ribs of some enormous creature that had died mid-stride and been left exactly where it fell. Every surface was covered in a thick layer of rust and grime, streaked in places where moisture had run down and dried again over years, maybe decades. Old scoring marks scarred the plating near the bow, the kind of damage that comes from weapons fire, not accident. I had heard stories about ships like this. Everyone had. Human warships, built during a period the rest of the galaxy still spoke about carefully, in the tone people use when they are choosing their words around something they do not fully understand and would rather not provoke. Humanity had not been part of the wider galactic community for very long, not by the standards of older species, but in that short time they had built a reputation that outlasted whatever peace treaties eventually followed. Stories about their wars were the kind adults told to make younger listeners sit up straight and stop fidgeting. But those wars were long over. Human ships like this one were relics now, obsolete, replaced generations ago by faster and quieter designs. Even humanity's own military had moved on from hulls like this, according to the trade reports I had read. Whatever this ship had once been capable of, its time had clearly passed. Looking at it slumped in that dim hangar, coated in rust thick enough to flake off in places like old paint, I felt none of the old dread the stories were supposed to inspire. I felt something closer to pity, and underneath that, the familiar hum of calculation returning to my thoughts. Scrap value. That was the first thing that came to mind, and I am not ashamed to admit it. A hull that size, even gutted and rusted, would still contain tons of metal, wiring, and components that could be stripped and sold. Whatever this ship had once been, whatever battles it had survived or lost, none of that mattered to the market. Metal was metal. I started walking closer, already mentally drafting a list of buyers who might be interested in bulk salvage, my mind drifting toward numbers and margins instead of history. The closer I got, the more details emerged from the gloom. The ship's boarding ramp was down, though barely, tilted at an angle that suggested the hydraulics had failed rather than been deliberately lowered. Inside, past the ramp, I could see the dim outline of a corridor swallowed by darkness. I hesitated there at the base of the ramp, one hand resting on the cold, pitted metal railing, listening. The hangar was silent except for the faint hum of the station's failing power grid somewhere behind the walls. No obvious signs of movement, no sounds of any systems still active inside the ship. Whatever this vessel had once been, it seemed as dead as everything else Corvat Station's bankrupt owners had left behind. I told myself that, and mostly, I believed it. I climbed the ramp carefully, testing each step before putting my full weight down. The metal groaned beneath me but held. Near the top, I paused to look back at the hangar one more time, at the ship's rusted hull rising above me like a wall, and something about the angle made me notice details I had missed from the ground. The dust in the hangar was not evenly spread. It was a small thing, the kind of detail I might have dismissed if I had not spent years training myself to notice exactly this sort of inconsistency. Scavenging teaches you to read a space the way a doctor reads a patient, looking for what does not belong, what breaks the pattern established by everything around it. Across most of the hangar floor, a thick, undisturbed layer of gray dust covered every surface evenly, the kind of coating that builds up slowly over years without interruption. But near a maintenance panel bolted to the wall beside the ship's landing struts, the dust was thinner, disturbed. As if something had brushed against it recently, or as if that panel, unlike everything else in this forgotten hangar, had been opened and closed more than once. I filed the observation away, and kept moving, telling myself it was probably nothing. Automated systems, maybe. Some kind of maintenance drone left running on a low-power cycle, still going through the motions of a job that no longer served any purpose. It happened sometimes with old station equipment, forgotten machines looping through routines long after the reason for those routines had disappeared. That explanation satisfied me, mostly, and I stepped through the ship's open hatch and into the darkness beyond. The interior smelled stronger here, that same old, dry, almost sweet scent from before, mixed now with the sharper tang of rust and stale recycled air. My handheld light cut a narrow beam through the corridor, catching drifting motes of dust that spun lazily in the disturbed air. The walls here were lined with panels, some hanging loose on broken hinges, wires spilling out of open conduits like tangled vines. Everything about the scene told the same story: abandonment, decay, the slow entropy of a ship left to rot for far longer than anyone had intended. And yet, the floor beneath my feet was clear of the thick dust that coated the walls and ceiling, not spotless, not obviously cleaned, but clear enough that the difference was impossible to ignore once I noticed it. The path, faint but consistent, ran down the center of the corridor, as if something had walked this route often enough over the years to keep the dust from settling the way it had everywhere else. I stopped walking. For a long moment, I stood perfectly still in that narrow corridor, listening. My own breathing sounded too loud in the silence, and I found myself straining to hear past it, waiting for some sound that would explain the path in the dust, some hum of machinery or shuffle of movement that would let me relax and file this away as nothing more than an old maintenance routine, still running on autopilot. Nothing came. Just silence and the faint metallic ticking of the ship's hull settling around me, the kind of sound old metal makes when temperatures shift, nothing more. I decided the wisest thing to do was continue my survey quickly and get back to the station's main ring before I let my imagination run further ahead of the evidence. I am not a superstitious person. I do not believe in ghosts, or curses, or any of the half-dozen other explanations that scavengers sometimes whisper about when they find something in a derelict that they cannot immediately explain. There is always a rational answer. Usually it is boring. Usually it involves a forgotten drone, a stuck relay, or simple coincidence dressed up by an overactive imagination. I moved deeper into the ship, cataloging what I found as I went, partly out of habit, and partly to keep my mind occupied with something other than the growing unease settling in my chest. The corridor opened into what had once been a crew common area, rows of bolted-down seating arranged around a central table, its surface scarred with old burn marks and scratches that told stories I could only guess at. A few personal items remained scattered across the room, faded and dulled by time. A cup, still sitting upright on a shelf as if someone had set it down and simply never come back for it. A framed image, its details too faded to make out clearly, propped against the wall. Whoever had lived on this ship had not packed up and left in an orderly fashion. They had left in a hurry, or they had not left at all. That thought settled uncomfortably in my mind as I continued my survey, moving from the common area toward what I assumed would be the ship's bridge, further up toward the bow. The corridor there narrowed, the walls closing in slightly, forcing me to walk single file past more open panels and hanging wires. My light swept across old warning signs, their text faded but still legible in places, written in the blocky human alphabet that I had learned to recognize during years of trading with human merchants along the border routes. Restricted access. Authorized personnel only. I almost laughed at that. There was nobody left to authorize anything, as far as I could tell, and certainly nobody left to enforce a restriction that had probably not mattered in decades. I pushed forward past the sign, my light catching the outline of a heavy door ahead, sealed shut, its edges rimmed with a thin layer of frost that should not have been possible given the hangar's otherwise stable temperature. Frost meant cold. Cold in a sealed compartment on a ship that had supposedly been powered down and abandoned for years meant something was still running some kind of environmental system behind that door. My earlier explanation, the comfortable idea of a forgotten maintenance drone looping through empty routines, suddenly felt a lot less satisfying. I reached out and pressed my palm against the door's cold surface, feeling the faint vibration of something operating on the other side. Not loud, not obvious, but present, unmistakably present, a low hum that traveled up through the metal and into my hand like a heartbeat. Behind me, in the darkness of the corridor I had just walked through, I heard something shift. It was not a large sound. If I had been anywhere else, doing anything else, I might not have noticed it at all. But standing there in that cold, silent corridor, every sense sharpened by growing unease, I heard it clearly, the faint scrape of something moving against metal, somewhere behind me, back the way I had come. I turned slowly, sweeping my light back down the corridor. The beam caught nothing but dust drifting through the still air and the same rusted walls I had already passed. No shape, no movement, nothing that could explain the sound I had heard. And yet, as I stood there, light shaking slightly in my hand, I became increasingly certain of one simple, uncomfortable fact. I was not alone on this ship. Whatever I had bought for $1, whatever this rusted, forgotten warship truly was, it had not been sitting empty and lifeless for all those years, the way everyone at the auction had assumed. Something on board had been keeping the dust from settling in certain places. Something had been maintaining at least one sealed compartment well enough to keep frost forming on its door, and now, somewhere behind me in the dark, something had made a sound deliberate enough that I could not convince myself it was simply the hull settling. I thought about turning back immediately, about retreating down the ramp and sealing the hangar door behind me, letting this particular mystery remain unsolved while I figured out what to do next from a safer distance. Every instinct built by years of careful scavenging told me that was the smart choice, the choice that would keep me breathing long enough to enjoy whatever profit I eventually made from this strange $1 purchase. But curiosity has always been my weakness, the trait that made me good at my job and occasionally put me in situations I probably should have avoided. I could not simply walk away without at least trying to understand what I had found. So instead of retreating, I took a slow, careful step forward, back into the darkness where the sound had come from, my light raised, my breath held tight in my chest. The corridor stretched ahead of me, silent once more, dust hanging motionless in the beam of my light. Whatever had made that sound was no longer moving, or had moved somewhere I could not see. I walked forward anyway, one careful step at a time, past the common area with its abandoned cup and faded photograph, back toward the ship's main hatch and the hangar beyond. That was when I saw it, near the base of the ramp where I had first boarded, exactly where I had noticed the disturbed dust around the maintenance panel earlier. The panel was open now. It had been closed when I passed it the first time. I was certain of that, certain enough to stake my reputation as a careful observer on it. Now it hung ajar, revealing a dark space behind it that my light could not quite penetrate. I stood at the top of the ramp, staring down at that open panel, and felt the full weight of my earlier certainty crumble away. This was not a forgotten drone looping through empty routines. This was not simple hull settling, or my imagination running away with me in the dark. Something on this ship was active, deliberate, and aware enough to move through spaces while I was elsewhere, aware enough to open a panel that had been closed only minutes before. Whatever it was, it knew I was here. And as I stood frozen at the top of that ramp, staring into the darkness of the hangar beyond, I found myself reconsidering everything I thought I understood about the bargain I had made. $1 had bought me a ship that, by every reasonable measure, should have been worthless, rusted, gutted, abandoned for years, its only real value lying in the metal that could be stripped from its bones and sold for scrap. But nothing about what I had experienced in the last hour suggested this ship was truly empty, or truly worthless, or truly abandoned in the way the auction house's careless paperwork had implied. Something had been living inside these rusted walls, maintaining small parts of this wreck with a patience and purpose that no forgotten drone could explain. I took a slow breath, steadying myself, and made a decision that I would spend a great deal of time reconsidering over the following days. Instead of retreating to the safety of the station's main ring, I stepped back down the ramp, toward that open panel, determined to finally understand exactly what I had bought. The dust around my feet stirred as I moved, and somewhere deeper in the hangar's shadows, I heard that same faint scrape of metal against metal, closer now than before, patient and unhurried, as if whatever waited in the darkness had all the time in the world, and was simply waiting to see what I would do next. I did not sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the cramped office I rented near the station's lower docks, staring at a wall of old records I had pulled from every public database I could access, trying to piece together the history of the ship I had bought for the price of a stale drink. It took hours, and most of what I found was frustratingly thin, scattered across old shipping logs, decommission notices, and half-deleted military archives that had clearly been scrubbed of anything useful long before I ever got access to them. What I did find told me this. The ship's designation, painted somewhere on its hull beneath decades of rust, matched a registry entry for a vessel called the Kestrel, built during a period of human military expansion that most other species preferred not to discuss in polite company. According to the fragments I pieced together, the Kestrel had been part of a small task force assigned to a border conflict in a sector I had never heard of, fighting alongside allies whose names had long since been erased from any record I could access. The records ended abruptly, the way military files sometimes do when the outcome of an engagement is either classified or simply too costly to document honestly. There was no note of the Kestrel's destruction. There was no note of its survival either. It had simply stopped appearing in any log after a certain date, as if it had slipped quietly out of history and into whatever forgotten storage facility eventually became Corvat Station's lower hangar ring. That silence bothered me more than any battle record could have. A ship destroyed in combat leaves evidence. Wreckage, debris fields, insurance claims, salvage rights disputes, formal notices sent to grieving families. A ship that simply vanishes from the record leaves nothing but questions, and questions were exactly what I had far too many of already. By morning, I had convinced myself of one thing. Whatever, or whoever, was still moving through that ship's corridors deserved a far more careful approach than I had given it the day before. I am not a soldier. I am not equipped to face down an unknown threat in a dark, unfamiliar space, and I had no intention of walking back into that hangar, unprepared a second time. I spent the next several hours gathering what limited resources a scavenger on the edge of a dying trade route could reasonably access. A portable scanner, capable of detecting active power signatures, a stronger light rig than the handheld I had used the day before, and, more out of habit than any real expectation of needing it, a short-range communicator preset to broadcast an open distress signal if I triggered it manually. I told myself I was being thorough, not afraid. I have found, over the years, that the difference between those two states is mostly a matter of how loudly you are willing to admit the truth to yourself. When I returned to the hangar, the door was already open. I remember stopping just outside the threshold, staring at the gap where the heavy door should have been sealed shut, exactly as I had left it the day before. I was certain I had closed it properly. I had checked twice, out of the same habitual thoroughness that had kept me alive through years of solo salvage work in places far more dangerous than a bankrupt station's forgotten storage ring. And yet here it was, standing open just wide enough for a single person to slip through, as if someone, or something, had been waiting for my return and had decided to make the invitation explicit. I stood there for a long moment, scanner in one hand, light rig slung over my shoulder, weighing my options. Every rational part of my mind told me to turn around, to report the anomaly to station security, to let someone with actual training handle whatever was waiting inside that hangar. But station security on Corvat had been reduced to a skeleton crew years ago, more concerned with keeping the docking clamps functional than investigating strange occurrences in a hangar most of them probably did not even remember existed. Reporting this would likely mean waiting days for a response that might never come, all while whatever was inside that ship continued doing whatever it had been doing for years without my knowledge. I decided to go in myself, scanner raised, senses sharpened, moving with a caution I had not fully committed to the day before. The hangar looked exactly as I remembered it, the same rusted hull rising above me in the dim light, the same thick dust coating every surface except for that telltale path leading toward the ship's open hatch. My scanner hummed quietly in my hand, its display flickering, as it struggled to make sense of the readings coming from somewhere deep inside the vessel. A power signature, faint but steady, pulsing at intervals that felt almost deliberate, almost like breathing. I followed the signal, retracing my steps from the day before, up the ramp and into the corridor beyond. The air inside felt colder than I remembered, and my breath fogged faintly in front of my face as I moved deeper into the ship. The scanner's readings grew stronger the further I went, guiding me back toward that sealed door with the frost-rimmed edges, the one I had found near the end of my survey the previous day. This time, the door was open. Not wide, just a narrow gap, enough to see a thin sliver of pale light spilling out into the corridor. The first sign of active illumination I had encountered anywhere on this supposedly dead ship. I approached slowly, scanner readings climbing steadily as I closed the distance, my other hand hovering near the communicator clipped to my belt, ready to trigger the distress signal at the first sign of real danger. I reached the door and paused, listening. Beyond the narrow gap, I could hear a faint, rhythmic sound, mechanical and steady, like the quiet hum of equipment running through a routine maintenance cycle. Underneath that hum, almost too faint to notice, I thought I heard something else. Breathing, slow and deliberate, the unmistakable sound of something alive. I pushed the door open the rest of the way, my light raised, my scanner clutched tightly in my other hand, and stepped into a room that would completely reshape everything I thought I understood about the ship I had bought for $1. The compartment beyond the door was small, clearly some kind of maintenance or storage bay, repurposed for a very different function than its original design intended. Cables ran along the walls in neat, deliberate lines, feeding into a cluster of equipment arranged with obvious care, everything clean and functional, despite the decay that had consumed the rest of the ship. In the center of the room stood a tall, upright pod, its surface frosted with a thin layer of ice, faint blue light pulsing softly from somewhere deep within its casing. A cryopod. Old technology, the kind humans had used generations ago for long-range travel, before more advanced propulsion methods made such measures unnecessary. But this one was active, its systems humming quietly, maintaining whatever was sealed inside despite years, possibly decades, of otherwise total abandonment aboard this ship. I stood there staring at that pod, scanner readings confirming what my eyes were already telling me. There was something alive inside it, something that had been kept alive, deliberately, carefully, by systems that someone had gone to considerable effort to keep running long after everything else on this ship had been left to rust and decay. I do not know how long I stood there, caught somewhere between fascination and a rapidly growing sense of dread. Long enough, apparently, for whatever had been watching me since the moment I first stepped aboard this ship to decide that hiding was no longer necessary. Behind me, the maintenance panel I had noticed the day before, the one that had mysteriously opened while I was elsewhere in the ship, hissed softly as it slid fully open, revealing a dark space behind it that I had not thought to check. And from that darkness, slowly, deliberately, something began to emerge. I turned, light raised, every instinct screaming at me to retreat, and found myself staring at a machine unlike anything I had encountered in years of salvage work across dozens of derelict ships. It was humanoid in shape, tall, its frame constructed from the same dark, battle-scarred metal as the ship itself, as if it had been built from the kestrel's own bones. Faint lights glowed along its joints and across what I assumed was some kind of optical sensor array where a face might have been on a living creature. It moved with a fluid, deliberate grace that felt entirely at odds with its heavy, armored frame, each step precise and controlled despite the obvious weight it carried. I froze, my scanner forgotten in my hand, my light trembling slightly as I tried to process what I was seeing. This was not a simple maintenance drone. This was not some forgotten automated system looping through empty routines. This was something built with purpose, built for a function far more specific than basic upkeep, and every line of its construction told me exactly what that function was. This thing had been built to fight. It stopped several meters away from me, close enough that I could hear the faint whir of servos adjusting somewhere within its frame, far enough that I still had a narrow window to retreat if things went badly. Its optical array focused directly on me, unblinking, patient, assessing. I had the distinct impression that I was being evaluated, weighed against some internal criteria I had no way of understanding, and that the outcome of that evaluation would determine what happened next. I raised my hands slowly, palms open, the universal gesture of peaceful intent that I hoped translated across whatever cultural or programming gap separated us. My voice, when I finally found it, came out far steadier than I expected, given how hard my hearts were pounding in my chest. I told it my name. I told it I had purchased this hangar and everything inside it through a legal auction, that I had not come here intending harm, that I only wanted to understand what I had found. It was not a particularly eloquent speech, delivered in a voice that shook more than I would have liked, but it was honest, and in my experience, honesty tends to translate better than clever words when you are trying to convince something dangerous that you are not a threat. The machine remained motionless for a long moment after I finished speaking, its optical array still fixed on me, with that same unnerving, patient focus. Then, slowly, it tilted its head slightly to one side, a gesture so unexpectedly human that it caught me completely off guard, and spoke in a voice that carried none of the mechanical harshness I had braced myself for. The voice that came from that armored frame was calm, measured, and carried the unmistakable cadence of someone who had not spoken aloud in a very long time. It asked me a single question, simple in its wording, but heavy with implications I would not fully understand until much later. It asked whether I had come to finish what the others had started. I did not know how to answer that question, not then, standing frozen in that cold, frost-rimmed room, with an armored guardian standing between me and a cryopod, holding who knew what kind of survivor from a war I barely understood. All I could do was tell the truth, the only truth I actually possessed in that moment. I told it I did not know what it was talking about. I told it I had bought a hangar for $1, expecting nothing but scrap metal and dust, and had instead found a mystery I was only beginning to understand. I told it I meant no harm, to it, to whoever was sleeping in that pod, or to whatever remained of this ship and its long, unrecorded history. The machine studied me for a long moment longer, servos whirring softly as it processed my answer, weighing my words against whatever standards it used to judge sincerity. Finally, it took a single step back, lowering itself into a posture that felt less immediately threatening, though every line of its frame still radiated a kind of restrained readiness that told me this was far from over. It told me its designation, a string of letters and numbers that meant nothing to me at the time, followed by a simpler word, one that it seemed to prefer using instead. It called itself a warden. Its function, it explained in that same calm, measured voice, was simple: protect the ship, protect what remained inside it, and judge, carefully and without mercy, anyone who came aboard uninvited. I asked, as carefully as I could manage, who was inside the pod behind it. The warden's optical array flickered slightly, the closest thing to hesitation I had seen from it since our encounter began. When it finally answered, its voice carried a weight that made the cold air in that room feel even colder. It told me the pod contained the last surviving member of the Kestrel's crew, placed into stasis decades earlier, kept alive through systems the warden itself had maintained ever since, waiting for a rescue that had never come, on a ship that history itself seemed to have decided was better off forgotten. I stood there in that frost-rimmed room, scanner forgotten in my hand, staring at an armored guardian built from the bones of a dead warship, and felt the full weight of exactly what my $1 purchase actually represented finally settle over me. This was not scrap metal. This was not an empty hull waiting to be stripped for parts. This was a grave, and a cradle, and a fortress, all built around a single sleeping survivor that one lone, patient machine had refused to abandon, no matter how many years passed, no matter how thoroughly the rest of the galaxy had chosen to forget. Whatever I had bought, it was far more than I had bargained for, and as the warden turned its optical array back toward the pod behind it, its posture shifting once more into that same watchful, patient stillness I had first mistaken for simple stillness, I understood that walking away now was no longer a choice I was willing to make. Over the following days, I returned to the hangar again and again, each visit a little less frightening than the last, though never entirely comfortable. It watched every movement I made with that same unblinking focus, positioning itself between me and the cryopod whenever I came within a certain distance, a boundary it never stated aloud, but which I learned to respect after the second time it stepped in front of me without warning. I brought supplies. Replacement parts scavenged from other derelicts, power cells compatible with the ship's aging systems, basic tools that might help stabilize the failing infrastructure, keeping both the cryopod and the warden itself functional. I did not do this purely out of kindness, if I am being honest. Curiosity drove me as much as anything else. I wanted to understand what I had found, and understanding required keeping both the machine and its charge intact long enough to learn their story. The warden, for its part, seemed to interpret my continued presence as a kind of tentative proof of good intent. It began speaking more freely during my visits, answering questions I asked, though always carefully, always measuring its words as if every piece of information it shared had to be weighed against some internal calculation of risk versus necessity. I learned that its designation translated roughly to Unit 7, though it preferred the simpler term it had chosen for itself. Warden felt less like a name and more like a description of purpose, and the more time I spent around it, the more I understood that purpose was the only thing this machine had left. It told me about the battle that had brought the Kestrel to this state, though the account came in fragments, offered slowly across multiple conversations, rather than delivered all at once. The ship had been part of a small task force sent to defend a contested border region, outnumbered from the start, relying on tactics and determination to make up for a disadvantage in raw numbers that should have been insurmountable. For a while, it had worked. The Kestrel and its allies held the line far longer than anyone expected, buying time for reinforcements that were supposed to arrive within days. The reinforcements never came. I did not press for details about why, though I gathered, from the careful way the warden discussed the matter, that the failure had not been purely circumstantial. There was betrayal woven somewhere into that story, a decision made by someone higher up the chain of command who had chosen to abandon the task force rather than risk additional resources on a battle that political calculations had already deemed unwinnable. The warden never named names, and I never asked it to. Some wounds, I have learned, are better left unpoked, especially when the person carrying them is a heavily armored machine capable of considerable and precise destruction. What remained of the Kestrel's crew, by the time the battle finally ended, was a single survivor. A soldier named Elena Vance, gravely injured, kept alive only through emergency stasis protocols activated in the ship's final moments before it limped away from the battle under minimal power, guided by systems barely holding together, toward the nearest safe harbor its damaged navigation could locate. That harbor turned out to be Corvat Station, then a much busier hub than the failing outpost I knew it as today. The shipping company that eventually claimed ownership of the abandoned hangar had, according to records the warden had somehow managed to access and preserve over the years, initially intended to salvage the Kestrel for parts, exactly as I had assumed when I first laid eyes on it. But something had stopped them, whether it was bureaucratic tangles, unresolved questions about military jurisdiction, or simple corporate indifference toward a project that promised more trouble than profit. The Kestrel had been sealed away in that hangar, and largely forgotten, its existence reduced to a single line item in an inventory list nobody bothered to read carefully. Nobody except the warden, who had spent every year since maintaining what little it could, keeping the cryopod functional through failing power grids and scavenged replacement parts, waiting for a rescue that the rest of the galaxy had apparently decided was not worth mounting. I asked, during one of these conversations, why the warden had never simply left, taken the pod somewhere with better facilities, somewhere Elena might actually receive the medical attention she clearly needed, rather than remaining suspended indefinitely in a slowly decaying stasis field. The warden's answer, when it finally came, was simple enough to make my chest tighten uncomfortably. It told me it had tried, once, years earlier. It had attempted to transport the pod to a nearby medical facility, only to discover that Elena's case had been quietly flagged, her identity buried under classified designations that made any outside facility, unwilling to accept her without authorization, the warden had no way of obtaining. Whoever had made the decision to abandon the Kestrel's task force had apparently also made sure that any survivors would remain conveniently lost to the system, an inconvenient loose end tidied away rather than properly resolved. I sat with that information for a long time after the warden finished speaking, turning it over in my mind, feeling something uncomfortably close to anger stirring beneath my usual careful detachment. I am, by nature and profession, someone who tries to stay out of other people's conflicts. Scavengers who involve themselves in politics tend not to last long in this business. But hearing the warden describe, in that calm, measured voice, years of quiet, patient devotion to a survivor the rest of the galaxy had deliberately chosen to forget, I found it increasingly difficult to maintain my usual professional distance. I asked the warden what it needed. Real medical care, functioning facilities, someone with actual authority to cut through whatever bureaucratic tangle had kept Elena trapped in that failing stasis pod for years longer than necessary. The warden's response surprised me, not because of what it said, but because of the raw, unguarded hope I heard underneath its carefully measured words. It told me it needed someone willing to ask the right questions, in the right places, without drawing the kind of attention that might make whoever had buried Elena's case in the first place decide it was time to finish the job properly, rather than simply hoping the problem would fade away on its own. I am not a hero. I want to be clear about that, because everything that happened afterward might make it sound like I suddenly transformed into some noble figure driven purely by selfless conviction. That is not what happened. I am a scavenger, a trader, someone who has spent his entire career finding value in things other people gave up on. What I felt, sitting in that cold, frost-rimmed room, was not some sudden burst of heroism. It was recognition. I had found genuine, tangible value hidden inside something everyone else had dismissed as worthless, and I was not about to let bureaucratic cowardice erase that value simply because acknowledging it might prove inconvenient for someone with more power than conscience. So I started asking questions. It took nearly a week of careful digging, working through contacts I had built over years of trading along the border routes, calling in favors from people who owed me more than they were comfortable admitting. Most of what I found confirmed what the warden had already told me, buried under layers of classification that made accessing anything concrete feel like pulling teeth from a creature actively trying to bite back. But eventually, I found a thread worth pulling. A retired logistics officer, someone who had served during the same period as the Kestrel's final battle, willing to talk, quietly, off the record, in exchange for a modest payment, and the promise that his name would never surface in connection with whatever I did with the information he provided. He confirmed the broad strokes of what the warden had described. A task force sacrificed for political convenience, survivors deliberately buried under classified designations, to avoid uncomfortable questions about accountability, the entire incident quietly erased from official narratives that preferred to remember only the victories, not the costs. He also gave me a name, someone still active, still holding a position of influence, someone who had been directly involved in the decision to abandon the Kestrel's task force all those years ago. I will not share that name here, not because I owe the person any protection, but because pursuing that thread led somewhere far more complicated than I anticipated, and the details deserve their own careful telling, rather than being rushed through as a footnote to Elena's story. What matters, for now, is that I brought this information back to the hangar, back to the warden, and watched something shift in the way it carried itself as I explained what I had found. It was subtle, a slight easing in its posture, the faintest hint of something that might have been relief passing through the pattern of its optical array's flickering lights. Years of patient, isolated devotion, and finally, someone outside its narrow, guarded world had confirmed that the story it had carried alone for so long was not simply a delusion born of malfunctioning systems and prolonged isolation. It was real. Elena Vance was real, her sacrifice was real, and the injustice done to her was real as well, buried but not erased, waiting for someone willing to dig it back up into the light. I told the warden I intended to keep digging, to find a way to get Elena the medical care she needed, to hold accountable whoever had decided her survival was an inconvenience better left forgotten. The warden studied me for a long moment after I finished speaking, its optical array focused with an intensity that felt different from the wary, evaluating gaze I had grown used to over the previous days. When it finally spoke, its voice carried a weight I had not heard from it before, something that sounded almost like gratitude, tempered by a caution built from years of disappointment. It told me it would help, in whatever way it could, but it also warned me, carefully and deliberately, that pursuing this path would not be simple. Whoever had buried Elena's case had done so thoroughly, and people willing to sacrifice an entire task force for political convenience were unlikely to appreciate a scavenger with a $1 hanger suddenly threatening to unravel their careful cover story. I told the warden I understood the risk. I did not. Not fully. Not yet. But I was about to. That same evening, as I made my way back through Korvat Station's quiet lower ring toward my rented office, I noticed something that made my heart skip uncomfortably in my chest. Two figures, unfamiliar, dressed in nondescript clothing that nonetheless carried the unmistakable bearing of people trained for something considerably more serious than casual station security, standing near the entrance to my building, watching the corridor with a patience that felt entirely too deliberate to be coincidental. I did not approach them directly. Instead, I circled around through a maintenance corridor I had used before for exactly this kind of situation, slipping into my office through a side entrance most people did not know existed. My hands were shaking slightly as I secured the door behind me, adrenaline finally catching up with the calm, careful facade I had maintained throughout the day's conversation with the warden. Someone had noticed my questions. Someone had decided, apparently quite quickly, that those questions warranted a response. I spent that night compiling everything I had learned, every fragment of information the retired logistics officer had shared, every detail the warden had confirmed about Elena's case, backing it all up across multiple secure locations, determined that whatever happened next, the truth I had uncovered, would not simply vanish along with me if things went badly. It was not bravery exactly that drove me through those long hours of careful methodical work. It was stubbornness, the same stubbornness that had made me bid $1 on a hanger nobody else wanted, refusing to walk away from something simply because everyone else had already decided it was not worth the trouble. By the time dawn cycle lighting finally began filtering through Korvat Station's ancient environmental systems, I had made my decision. I was not going to back down, not from the questions I had started asking, and not from the responsibility I had somehow, almost accidentally, taken on the moment I climbed that rusted boarding ramp and met a patient, watchful guardian, who had spent years refusing to give up on the one person left in his care. Whatever came next, I intended to see this through. I only hoped the warden's warning about the danger ahead had not been an understatement. The two figures I had spotted outside my office did not simply disappear once I noticed them. Over the following 2 days, I caught glimpses of them, or others like them, at odd moments throughout the station, once near the market ring, where I bought my morning provisions, once outside the small archive terminal I used to continue my research. They never approached directly, never said a word to me, but their presence followed a pattern too consistent to dismiss as coincidence, a slow, deliberate pressure applied from a distance, the kind of surveillance meant to unsettle rather than confront. I told the warden about it during my next visit, watching carefully for its reaction. The optical array flickered briefly, a pattern I had come to recognize as something like concern, though I hesitated to assign the machine emotions it might not actually possess. When it spoke, its voice carried a new edge of urgency I had not heard before. It told me that whoever had noticed my questions was almost certainly connected to the same networks that had buried Elena's case in the first place, and that their willingness to send observers so quickly suggested a level of ongoing vigilance that implied they had never fully stopped watching for exactly this kind of complication. Years of quiet burial, apparently, had not meant years of carelessness. Someone had kept a distant, patient eye on this situation the entire time, waiting to see if it would ever resurface. I asked the warden what it thought I should do. Its answer was immediate and absolute. Continue gathering evidence, but do so more carefully, and above all, Avoid drawing the kind of attention that might convince whoever was watching that the safest solution to their problem was to eliminate the person asking questions rather than simply monitoring him. I tried to follow that advice. I truly did. But subtlety has never been my strongest skill, and 3 days later, subtlety stopped being an option entirely. I was returning to my office late in the station's artificial evening cycle, having spent the day cross-referencing shipping manifests that hinted at additional details about the Kestrel's final battle, when I noticed the same maintenance corridor I usually used for a discreet approach was blocked. Not by debris or malfunctioning equipment, but by a figure standing squarely in the middle of the passage, arms crossed, watching me approach with an expression that made it very clear this encounter was not accidental. I stopped several meters away, my heart's pounding, running through my limited options. Behind me, the main corridor remained open, but something in the way this figure carried himself told me retreating that way would not actually solve my problem. I was reasonably confident, in that moment, that I had just walked directly into exactly the kind of confrontation the warden had warned me to avoid. The man spoke first, his voice calm, almost friendly, the tone of someone accustomed to delivering threats without ever needing to raise his volume. He told me my recent research had attracted attention from people who valued their privacy considerably more than they valued the curiosity of a scavenger who had gotten lucky at an auction. He suggested, with a politeness that made the underlying threat feel somehow worse, that it would be in my best interest to abandon my current line of inquiry, forget everything I had learned about the ship in Hangar 447, and return to whatever quiet, unremarkable life I had lived before bidding $1 on something that was never meant to be found. I did not have a clever response ready. I stood there, throat tight, trying to decide whether arguing, agreeing, or simply running would produce the best odds of walking away from this conversation unharmed. Before I could settle on any of those options, a second figure emerged from a side passage behind the first, confirming what I had already suspected. This was not a conversation. This was an intimidation exercise, carefully staged to make sure I understood exactly how outmatched I was. I do not know how long that standoff might have continued, or how it might have ended, because it did not get the chance to play out the way either of those two men clearly expected. The lights along the corridor flickered once, briefly, and then the maintenance hatch at the far end of the passage, the one leading toward the lower hangar ring where the Kestrel sat waiting, tore open with a shriek of protesting metal that echoed sharply through the enclosed space. Both men spun toward the sound, weapons already rising, and I watched their confident, practiced composure shatter almost instantly as something stepped through that opening that neither of them had been prepared to encounter. The warden moved into the corridor with a fluid, controlled precision that felt almost gentle compared to the raw power evident in every line of its armored frame. It did not rush, did not charge forward with the kind of reckless aggression I might have expected from a machine built for combat. Instead, it simply advanced, steady and unhurried, its optical array sweeping across both men with the same patient, evaluating focus it had once directed at me. I do not know exactly what happened in the moments that followed, not because I have chosen to omit details, but because everything unfolded with a speed that made it genuinely difficult to track. One moment, both men stood braced, weapons raised, clearly intending to use them. The next moment, the warden had closed the distance between them with a speed that seemed impossible for something built from such heavy, dense armor, and both weapons were no longer in their owner's hands. Nobody was harmed, not seriously. The warden's approach, I would learn later during a much calmer conversation, had been deliberately restrained, calculated to disable and disarm, rather than cause lasting injury. But the sheer, overwhelming display of capability, control, and speed left both men frozen against the corridor wall, all their earlier confidence completely stripped away, replaced by an expression I recognized instantly because I had worn something similar myself during my first encounter with this same machine. Fear, genuine, unfiltered fear, the kind that comes from suddenly understanding, in vivid and immediate terms, exactly how thoroughly outmatched you actually are. The warden did not say much. It did not need to. It simply stood between me and the two men, its posture radiating a quiet, absolute promise of consequence should either of them attempt anything further, and delivered a single, calm statement that I suspect neither of them will ever fully forget. It told them that the person they had come to threaten was under its protection, and that any further attempt to interfere would be met with considerably less restraint than they had just experienced. Both men left without another word, retreating down the corridor with a speed that made their earlier confident posturing feel almost laughable in retrospect. I stood there afterward, breathing hard, adrenaline finally catching up with everything that had just happened, staring at the machine that had just, quite casually, demonstrated exactly why old stories about human warships still made people nervous, even generations after those wars had officially ended. The warden turned toward me once the corridor was clear, its optical array settling into that same steady, watchful focus I had grown accustomed to over the previous days. It asked if I was unharmed, its voice carrying a note of genuine concern that caught me slightly off guard, given everything I had just witnessed. I told it I was fine, though my voice shook more than I would have liked. I asked how it had known where to find me, how it had reached me so quickly given the distance between the hangar and this corridor. Its answer was simple, and somehow more unsettling than the fight itself had been. It told me it had been monitoring my movements since our conversation about the surveillance I had noticed, using systems scattered throughout the station's lower ring that it had quietly reactivated and repurposed over the years, remnants of old security infrastructure most people had forgotten even existed. It had been watching over me, in other words, far more closely than I had ever realized, waiting patiently for exactly the kind of moment that had just occurred. I did not know whether to feel grateful or unnerved by that revelation. In the end, I settled on both. Word of that encounter spread faster than I expected. I do not know exactly how, whether the two men who had confronted me talked despite their obvious embarrassment, or whether station security picked up fragments of the incident through whatever monitoring systems still functioned in that lower ring. But within 2 days, I began noticing a subtle shift in how people around the station treated me. Fewer casual conversations at the market ring, more careful, measured glances from people who clearly knew something had happened, even if they did not know exactly what. The story, as it spread, grew considerably beyond what had actually occurred. By the time it reached the far edges of Korvat Station's remaining population, I had apparently purchased not simply a rusted warship, but some kind of unkillable guardian capable of tearing armed mercenaries apart without breaking stride. The exaggeration bothered me less than it probably should have, mostly because I understood, better than most, exactly how quickly rumors could calcify into accepted fact when nobody bothered to check the details. What concerned me more was the warden's own reaction to the growing attention. During my next visit to the hangar, I found it in a state I can only describe as heightened alertness, its optical array scanning constantly, its posture radiating attention that had not been present during our earlier conversations. When I asked what had changed, its answer confirmed exactly what I had feared since our first tense confrontation in that frost-rimmed room. It told me that word of its capabilities had likely reached beyond the immediate people who had tried to intimidate me, and that such information, once it started spreading, tended to attract attention from far more dangerous parties than a pair of local enforcers sent to deliver a simple warning. Old stories about human warships did not simply fade quietly into forgotten history. They lingered, carefully remembered by certain factions who understood, better than most casual observers, exactly what kind of threat those old conflicts had represented, and exactly what kind of opportunity might exist in either neutralizing or acquiring whatever remained of that old capability. I asked the warden if it was afraid. Its response, delivered in that same calm, measured voice, has stayed with me ever since. It told me fear, as I understood the concept, was not something it experienced in quite the same way a living being might. But it did experience something adjacent to concern, a calculated awareness of risk, weighed carefully against a singular, unwavering priority that had guided every decision it had made since the moment the Kestrel first arrived at this station, broken and abandoned, carrying its last surviving crew member into an uncertain future. That priority, it told me, had not changed, regardless of whatever new attention our recent actions had attracted. Protect Elena, protect the ship, and now, apparently, extend that same protection to the scavenger, foolish enough to bid $1 on a hangar nobody else wanted, and then foolish enough to keep asking questions long after every rational instinct should have told him to walk away. I did not know, standing there in that cold, familiar room, whether to laugh or feel genuinely terrified by what the warden's words implied about the days ahead. In the end, once again, I settled on both and made my way back toward my office through corridors that suddenly felt considerably more dangerous than they had just a week earlier, fully aware that whatever came next, I was no longer simply a bystander in this unfolding story. I had become part of it, whether I had intended to or not, and there was no reasonable way left to step back out. The retired logistics officer I had spoken with earlier agreed to a second meeting, though only after I assured him repeatedly that our conversation would remain as untraceable as possible. We met in a quiet corner of the market ring, surrounded by enough casual noise and foot traffic to make eavesdropping difficult, and he spoke in a low, careful voice that made it clear he understood exactly how much risk he was taking simply by continuing this conversation. He told me the name he had given me earlier belonged to a woman named Margaret Ashcombe, a senior logistics coordinator during the period of the Kestrel's final battle, now holding a considerably more influential position within a regional administrative body that oversaw military resource allocation across several sectors. According to him, Ashcombe had been directly responsible for the decision to redirect the reinforcements originally promised to the Kestrel's task force, choosing instead to divert those resources toward a different engagement she judged more politically valuable at the time. The task force's sacrifice, in other words, had not been an unavoidable tragedy of war. It had been a calculated trade, one life and one ship weighed against another, decided by someone sitting safely behind a desk far from any actual danger, who had then spent years afterward ensuring that the true story never surfaced to complicate her subsequent rise through the administrative ranks. I asked him why he was willing to share this information now, after presumably staying silent for so many years. His answer was simple, delivered with a tired, weary honesty that made me trust him more than any elaborate justification could have. He told me he had carried the guilt of his own silence for a long time, and that hearing someone was finally asking the right questions had felt like an opportunity he could not, in good conscience, continue to ignore. I thanked him, promised again to protect his identity, and left that meeting with considerably more than I had walked in expecting: a name, a motive, and, more importantly, a growing certainty that Elena Vance's continued isolation was not simply bureaucratic oversight, but a deliberate, ongoing effort to keep an inconvenient truth buried indefinitely. I brought this information back to the warden, watching carefully as it processed what I had learned. Its optical array flickered through a rapid sequence of patterns I had not seen before, and when it finally spoke, its voice carried a controlled intensity that made the cold room feel even colder than usual. It told me it had suspected something like this for years, though it had never possessed concrete evidence to confirm those suspicions. Hearing the truth stated plainly, after so long spent guessing at the shape of the injustice done to Elena and the rest of her crew, seemed to affect it more deeply than I expected a machine to be affected by anything. I asked what our next step should be. The warden's answer surprised me, not because of what it suggested, but because of how carefully it balanced determination against caution. It told me that confronting Ashcombe directly would likely be both dangerous and ultimately ineffective, given her apparent influence and the resources she clearly had access to, resources that had already demonstrated a willingness to send intimidation squads after a scavenger, simply for asking uncomfortable questions. Instead, it suggested a different approach: gather enough evidence, quietly and carefully, to make any attempt to silence us considerably more costly than simply allowing the truth to surface through proper channels. It was a patient strategy, the kind of careful, methodical approach that made sense coming from something that had already spent years demonstrating exactly how much patience it was capable of exercising. I agreed, though privately I wondered how much time we actually had before Ashcombe's people decided that patience was a luxury they were no longer willing to extend us. That worry proved justified sooner than either of us expected. 3 days after my meeting with the retired officer, I returned to my office to find it thoroughly searched, every drawer opened, every storage device missing, my carefully compiled research either stolen or destroyed. Whoever had done this had been careful, professional, leaving no obvious trace beyond the simple, undeniable fact that everything I had gathered was gone. Fortunately, I had learned enough from years of careful scavenging work to never keep my only copies of anything important in a single, easily accessible location. Backup copies existed, scattered across secure storage nodes I had set up specifically for situations like this one, but the message behind this search felt unmistakably clear. Someone wanted me to understand exactly how easily they could reach into my life and take whatever they wanted, whenever they decided the moment was right. I reported the break-in to the warden immediately, watching its posture shift into that same heightened alertness I had witnessed after our earlier confrontation with the 2 intimidation squad members. It told me, in a voice considerably more urgent than its usual calm, measured tone, that this escalation suggested Ashcombe's people had decided we represented a threat significant enough to warrant more aggressive countermeasures, and that we needed to accelerate our timeline considerably if we wanted to secure Elena's safety and expose the truth before those countermeasures grew even more severe. Over the following days, working with a speed born of genuine urgency rather than careless haste, I compiled everything I had gathered into a comprehensive, well-organized report, cross-referencing every fragment of evidence against publicly available records wherever possible, building a case designed to withstand the kind of scrutiny and denial I expected Ashcombe's allies would inevitably attempt. The warden contributed its own records, carefully preserved logs from the Kestrel's final battle that confirmed, in stark, unambiguous detail, exactly how the task force had been abandoned and exactly who had made that decision. Once the report was complete, the question became what to do with it. Simply publishing it publicly seemed risky, likely to be dismissed as fabricated or unreliable without proper institutional backing. Sending it directly to Ashcombe's superiors risked the information being quietly buried by someone equally invested in avoiding the embarrassment such a scandal would inevitably cause. I needed a path that would make burial difficult, that would force accountability rather than simply inviting another layer of careful, patient suppression. The warden suggested a solution that surprised me with its directness. It told me it maintained contact through channels it had carefully preserved over the years despite the Kestrel's official abandonment, with a small network of retired human military personnel who had served during the same conflict and who had never fully accepted the official narrative surrounding the task force's destruction. These were people with enough institutional knowledge and remaining influence to ensure our evidence would be taken seriously, distributed widely enough that simple denial would no longer be a viable strategy for anyone hoping to keep the truth contained. I asked why the warden had never reached out to this network before, given the obvious value such connections might have provided years earlier. Its answer, delivered with a quiet, careful honesty, revealed a dimension of its long isolation I had not fully appreciated until that moment. It told me it had feared, for years, that reaching out might draw attention from exactly the kind of people who had buried Elena's case in the first place, attention that might result in her stasis pod being seized or destroyed rather than properly rescued. Without concrete evidence to support its claims, any attempt to reach out risked exposing Elena's location without providing enough protection to guarantee her safety. It had chosen, instead, patient isolation, maintaining what little it could alone, waiting for exactly the kind of opportunity our recent research had finally provided. I understood, hearing that explanation, exactly how much weight this machine had been carrying alone for all those years, and exactly how much trust it was extending by finally reaching out through those preserved connections now, relying on evidence we had gathered together to finally break through a silence it had maintained out of desperate, careful necessity for far longer than any living being should reasonably have to endure. We sent the report that same evening, distributed carefully across the network the warden had maintained, along with copies secured in several independent locations designed to make suppression considerably more difficult than it might otherwise have been. Then we waited, uncertain exactly what kind of response our efforts would provoke, fully aware that whatever happened next would likely determine not just Elena's fate, but quite possibly our own safety as well. The response, when it finally came 2 days later, arrived in a form neither of us had fully anticipated. Corvette Station's ancient communication relay, normally handling little more than routine trade traffic and the occasional overdue supply request, suddenly found itself flooded with incoming messages, far more traffic than the aging system had processed in years. Word of our report had spread quickly through the network the warden maintained, and from there, apparently, considerably further than either of us had expected. Retired officers who had served alongside the Kestrel's task force reached out first, their messages carrying a mixture of grief, anger, and cautious hope that the truth might finally see daylight after so many years of institutional silence. Several offered to testify publicly, to add their own voices and remaining influence to the growing pressure our evidence had begun to generate. One, a former commanding officer, who had lost his own ship during that same doomed engagement, sent a message so raw, with long-buried emotion, that I found myself unable to finish reading it aloud when the warden asked what it said. But alongside that wave of support came something considerably more concerning: news of an active warden unit, fully functional, guarding a preserved human warship and its last surviving crew member, spread far beyond the small network we had initially reached out to. Within days, that information had apparently reached ears considerably less sympathetic to our cause, ears belonging to factions who remembered humanity's old conflicts not with grief or nostalgia, but with a calculating interest in whatever military technology might still be salvageable from those forgotten wars. The first sign of this new attention arrived in the form of an unfamiliar ship requesting docking clearance at Corvette Station, its registration listing it as an independent trading vessel, though its design and bearing suggested considerably more capability than any legitimate trader typically required. I watched its approach from the station's observation deck, a knot of unease settling in my stomach that only grew worse when I noticed a second, similarly unremarkable vessel arriving shortly afterward. I reported this development to the warden immediately, and its reaction confirmed my growing suspicion that we had moved well beyond the realm of simple bureaucratic cover-ups and local intimidation squads. It told me these ships likely belonged to one of several factions known for collecting decommissioned or presumed destroyed military technology, either for study, resale, or in some cases, outright weaponization against whoever they judged most likely to become a future rival. An active, combat-capable warden unit, especially one attached to a preserved human warship with a documented history of surviving impossible odds, represented exactly the kind of prize such factions actively sought. I asked what we should do. The warden's answer carried a grim, determined edge I had not heard from it before. It told me that whatever happened next, its priority remained unchanged: protect Elena, protect the ship, and now, protect the evidence that had finally begun forcing accountability onto people who had spent years assuming their actions would never face consequence. If that meant confronting whoever these newly arrived factions sent to test our defenses, it was prepared to do exactly that, regardless of the risk involved. Over the following 2 days, Corvette Station's lower ring, once a forgotten, largely ignored section of a dying outpost, became considerably more crowded than it had been in years. Representatives from the unfamiliar trading vessels made careful, probing inquiries around the station, asking questions about the hangar, about its contents, about the scavenger who had apparently purchased something considerably more valuable than anyone had originally realized. I did my best to avoid direct contact, relying on the warden's warnings and my own instincts to steer clear of anyone whose questions felt too pointed to be simple curiosity. That caution held for exactly 2 days before it inevitably failed. I was returning from a supply run when 3 figures intercepted me in a corridor near the market ring, their approach considerably more direct than the careful surveillance I had grown accustomed to from Ashcombe's people. These were not local enforcers sent to deliver a polite warning. Their bearing, their equipment, the calm, professional confidence with which they positioned themselves to block every obvious escape route, told me immediately that I was dealing with something considerably more dangerous than anything I had faced so far. Their leader, a woman with a calm, unsettlingly pleasant demeanor, introduced herself only by a designation rather than a name, and got straight to the point. She told me her employer was prepared to offer a substantial sum for the ship in Hangar 447, along with everything currently housed inside it. She made it clear, in the same pleasant, unhurried tone, that this offer represented considerably more generosity than I should expect to receive if I chose to refuse. I told her the ship was not for sale, that the survivor housed within its cryopod was a person, not merchandise, and that I had no intention of handing either of them over to whoever her employer represented. My voice shook slightly as I spoke, but I did not back down, drawing on a stubbornness that had carried me through every uncertain moment since I first bid $1 on a hangar nobody else wanted. The woman's pleasant expression did not waver, though something colder flickered briefly behind her eyes. She told me, with the same calm patience, that my refusal was noted and that her employer would simply need to explore alternative methods of acquiring what they wanted. I understood, immediately, exactly what that statement implied. I did not wait to see whether her threat would materialize immediately. I moved quickly back toward the lower ring, toward the hangar, my heart pounding with a mixture of fear and grim determination. Behind me, I heard the woman's calm voice giving quiet instructions to her companions, though I could not make out the details over the sound of my own hurried footsteps echoing through the station's narrow corridors. I reached the hangar just as alarms began sounding through the station's aging infrastructure, a chaotic mixture of docking clamp warnings and unauthorized access alerts that suggested our unwelcome visitors had decided patience was no longer a virtue worth exercising. The warden met me at the hangar's entrance, already fully alert, its optical array scanning the corridor behind me with sharp, focused intensity. It told me, without preamble, that it had detected multiple unauthorized attempts to access the station's lower ring security systems, consistent with exactly the kind of coordinated approach a well-resourced faction might use to isolate and secure a target before anyone could interfere or call for outside help. Whoever had sent that woman to intimidate me was moving forward with considerably more urgency than I had hoped for. I asked what we should do. The warden's answer was immediate and absolute. It told me to remain behind it, to stay close to the hangar's rear access point, in case a retreat became necessary, and to trust that it had prepared for exactly this kind of confrontation during every quiet, patient year it had spent maintaining this ship and its sleeping survivor, waiting, in some sense, for a moment just like this one. The first intruders arrived within minutes, moving through the hangar's main entrance with the practiced, coordinated efficiency of people who had done this kind of work many times before. I counted 6 figures, armed and armored, moving with a confidence that suggested they expected minimal resistance from whatever they assumed still remained functional aboard a supposedly derelict warship. That confidence lasted exactly as long as it took the warden to demonstrate exactly how mistaken they were. What followed unfolded with a speed and precision that left me standing frozen near the hangar's rear access point, watching a display of controlled, devastating capability that made every old story I had ever heard about human warships suddenly feel entirely, uncomfortably justified. The warden moved through that hangar like something built from an entirely different category of threat than anything those intruders had prepared for, disabling weapons, incapacitating armored figures with an efficient, almost surgical precision that left every single intruder alive, but thoroughly, undeniably defeated, within a span of time far shorter than I would have believed possible. By the time the last intruder had been disarmed and subdued, the entire confrontation had lasted less than 2 minutes. I stood there afterward, breathing hard, staring at 6 armed professionals now groaning quietly on the hangar floor, completely outmatched by a single machine that had spent years quietly maintaining a forgotten cryopod in isolated silence. The warden turned toward me once the immediate threat had been neutralized, its optical array settling into that same calm, watchful focus, though I could sense, somehow, a current of something like grim satisfaction running beneath its usual measured composure. It told me, simply, that it had warned these intruders' employer, indirectly, Through this decisive response, exactly what kind of consequence awaited anyone else who considered a similar approach. Whether that warning would actually deter future attempts remained uncertain, but for now, at least, the immediate threat had been thoroughly, unmistakably neutralized. News of that confrontation spread even faster than the earlier rumors about my encounter with Ashcombe's intimidation squad. Within a day, the story had transformed, growing with each retelling, until the warden's reputation had solidified into something approaching legend across the wider network of traders, scavengers, and information brokers who frequented outposts like Korvat Station. A single guardian, protecting a rusted human warship purchased for the price of $1, had single-handedly repelled a professional extraction team without suffering so much as a scratch. The exaggerations bothered me less this time. If anything, I found myself grateful for them, understanding, with a clarity that had been slowly building since my very first encounter with the warden, that reputation itself had become one of our most valuable defenses. Whoever considered testing us next would now have to weigh their ambitions against a growing, unmistakable understanding that this particular hangar, and everything inside it, was protected by something considerably more dangerous than its rusted, unassuming exterior had ever suggested. Whether that reputation would prove sufficient to keep Elena, the warden, and myself safe going forward remained an open question, but for the first time since this entire strange, improbable story began, I allowed myself a small, cautious sense of hope that we might actually see this through to some kind of resolution worth the risk we had all taken to reach it. The days that followed the failed extraction attempt brought a shift I had not fully anticipated. The retired officers within the warden's preserved network, emboldened by both our evidence and the very public failure of the mercenary attempt to seize the ship by force, began pushing our case through official channels with a persistence that finally started producing results. Formal inquiries opened. Records that had remained conveniently classified for years suddenly found themselves subject to review by officials who could no longer justify ignoring evidence that had already spread far too widely to quietly suppress. Margaret Ashcombe did not go quietly. For nearly 2 weeks, her allies attempted every available strategy to discredit our report, questioning the authenticity of the warden's preserved battle logs, casting doubt on the retired logistics officer's credibility, even attempting to paint me as an opportunistic scavenger fabricating a dramatic story purely to extract sympathy and profit from a tragedy I had no real connection to. I will admit, during those 2 weeks, there were moments I genuinely feared the whole effort might collapse under the weight of her considerable remaining influence. What ultimately broke through that resistance was not any single piece of evidence, but the sheer, undeniable weight of everything combined. The warden's logs, the retired officer's testimony, the growing chorus of other veterans who had served during that same conflict, finally willing to add their own voices once they saw others speaking out first. And beneath all of it, the simple, human fact of Elena Vance herself, still alive, still waiting in a failing stasis pod for a rescue that had been deliberately denied to her for reasons that amounted to nothing more than political convenience. The formal inquiry concluded with a result that felt, after everything we had endured, almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. Ashcombe was removed from her position, facing formal charges related to dereliction of duty and the deliberate suppression of information regarding a surviving service member's status. Whatever punishment ultimately followed those charges mattered less to me, in the end, than the far more immediate outcome that our efforts had actually been fighting for all along. Elena Vance was finally, properly rescued. A proper medical transport arrived at Korvat Station 11 days after the failed extraction attempt, carrying a team of specialists experienced in exactly the kind of delicate stasis pod transfer her fragile condition required. The warden supervised every step of that transfer with a watchful intensity that made even the experienced medical team visibly nervous, though none of them argued against its presence, understanding, I think, exactly how much this moment meant to the machine that had spent so many years protecting her alone. I was there when they finally opened the pod, standing a respectful distance back, watching a process I barely understood unfold with careful, practiced precision. Elena Vance, when she finally woke, fully aware and lucid for the first time in longer than I could properly comprehend, was considerably younger looking than I had somehow expected, though the weariness in her eyes told a story that transcended simple physical age. Her first words, once she found her voice again after so many years of enforced silence, were not directed at me or at the medical team surrounding her. She looked past all of us, toward the armored figure standing quietly near the edge of the room, and spoke a single word that carried more weight than any lengthy speech could have managed. She simply said its designation, softly, disbelievingly, as if she could not quite convince herself that the guardian who had protected her through so many silent, forgotten years was actually standing there in front of her, real and present, after everything they had both endured together. The warden's response was equally simple, though I noticed, watching carefully, a subtle shift in its usual measured composure that I had never observed before. It told her, in a voice considerably softer than its usual calm, measured tone, that it had kept its promise. It had not left her, it never would have. I will not pretend I fully understood everything that passed between them in that moment, the specific weight of shared history and loyalty built across years of circumstances I could only partially imagine. But I understood enough to know that whatever had driven this machine to maintain its lonely vigil for so long, whatever combination of programming and something that felt considerably more like genuine devotion had kept it functioning through years of isolation and uncertainty, it had all been worth it, finally, in this single moment of quiet, hard-won reunion. Elena's recovery took time, considerably more time than I think any of us initially expected, but she did recover, gradually regaining strength and clarity with each passing week under the medical team's careful supervision. I visited often during that period, partly out of genuine concern for her well-being, and partly, I will admit, because I had grown genuinely invested in a story that had started, improbably, with a $1 bid at a bankruptcy auction nobody else cared about. The Kestrel itself remained in that same hangar throughout Elena's recovery, though its condition began improving as well, thanks to a combination of Elena's own knowledge of its systems and resources that started flowing in once our case against Ashcombe concluded successfully. Veterans from the Warden's network, along with several sympathetic officials embarrassed by how thoroughly this situation had been mishandled, contributed both funding and expertise toward properly restoring at least some of the ship's original functionality. I want to be clear that I did not walk away from this entire experience suddenly wealthy, or suddenly transformed into some celebrated hero across the wider galactic community. Life, in my experience, rarely works that neatly. I remained, fundamentally, the same scavenger I had always been, still making my living finding value in things other people had given up on. But something had changed, quietly, beneath the surface of my ordinary, unremarkable existence. Elena, once she had recovered sufficiently, insisted on formally transferring partial ownership of the Kestrel back to me, a gesture I initially tried to refuse, feeling I had no real claim to something that meant so much more to her than any simple financial transaction could properly represent. She insisted anyway, telling me, with a quiet, determined firmness that reminded me considerably of the Warden's own careful, deliberate manner, that I had earned that claim through the risks I had taken and the choices I had made when simply walking away would have been so much easier. I accepted eventually, understanding that refusing her generosity would have dishonored the genuine gratitude behind it. The hangar that I had purchased for $1, expecting nothing more than scrap metal and a mildly amusing story to tell other traders, had become something else entirely. Not merely a rusted relic, but a home, gradually being restored, shared between a recovering survivor, her devoted guardian, and a scavenger who had somehow, almost accidentally, found himself woven permanently into their story. Word of everything that had happened continued spreading long after Elena's rescue concluded, carried across trade routes and information networks by traders and scavengers who found the entire improbable tale simply too compelling not to share. The story grew, as these things inevitably do, gathering embellishments and dramatic flourishes with each retelling, until the simple facts of what had actually occurred became almost secondary to the legend those facts had inspired. But beneath all the exaggeration, one core truth remained, consistent across every version of the story, that continued circulating through the galaxy's scattered outposts and trade hubs. A hangar in a forgotten corner of a dying station, purchased for the price of $1, had turned out to hold something far more valuable than anyone could have reasonably expected. Not simply a rusted warship, though the ship itself carried its own quiet significance. Not simply an advanced, formidable guardian, though that guardian's capabilities certainly gave the story its most dramatic moments. What that hangar truly held, in the end, was loyalty. Patient, unwavering, years-spanning loyalty, maintained through isolation and uncertainty by a machine that refused, absolutely and completely, to abandon the single person it had been built to protect. I think about that lesson often, now, whenever I find myself evaluating some new piece of forgotten cargo or overlooked salvage lot at whatever auction I happen to be attending. Value, I have learned, is rarely as simple as market prices and scrap weight calculations might suggest. Sometimes the most valuable things are exactly the ones everyone else has already decided are worthless, waiting patiently for someone willing to look closer, to ask the right questions, and to recognize what that closer look actually reveals. The rumors about our hangar persist even now, whispered carefully among traders who pass through outposts like Korvat Station, warnings shared quietly with anyone foolish enough to consider testing whatever protection still guards that rusted, unassuming warship. Nobody, as far as I know, has attempted anything since that failed extraction, and I suspect that reputation alone continues doing more to protect us than any additional confrontation ever could. As for me, I remain exactly where I started, in many ways. A scavenger, a trader, someone who understands, perhaps better than most, that the smallest, most overlooked bargains sometimes carry the largest, most unexpected weight. I spent $1 on a hangar that everyone else assumed was empty, and in doing so, found myself part of a story considerably larger and more meaningful than any simple financial transaction could have predicted. I do not regret that dollar, not for a single moment, despite everything it eventually cost and everything it eventually returned in ways I never could have anticipated when I first raised my hand in that crowded, indifferent auction hall. Some investments, I have come to understand, cannot be properly measured in credits or scrap value at all. Some investments are measured instead in the quiet, hard-won relief of a survivor finally waking to find the guardian who protected her still standing watch, exactly where she left him, exactly as steadfast and unwavering as the day their long, difficult journey together first began. And if the galaxy's wider community continues whispering nervous stories about a rusted human warship and the frightening, unyielding guardian who defends it, I find I have no real objection to that reputation lingering, undisturbed, for as long as it continues keeping the people I now consider genuinely worth protecting safely out of harm's way.